Hey guys, tonight we journey down a damp, winding cobblestone street in a medieval French town just after sundown. The lamps are flickering weakly behind wavy glass panes, and the smell of tanned leather mingles with chimney smoke and the faint tang of cabbage stew. You step carefully because the street is slick with mud, stray chicken feathers, and something vaguely organic. Welcome to a world where every toe you wiggle is quietly policed by a shoemaking guild, an institution both revered and frankly feared. And no, you probably wouldn't survive this walk, not unless your shoes had the proper stamp, the right heel height, and no scandalous embellishments. One rogue buckle, you're getting fined, my friend. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a little hamlet in the Alps or a foggy flat in London, drop your location and local time in the comments. Helps us imagine who's dozing off beside us across centuries. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step onto the street, the heel of your shoe sinking just a little too far into a rut between stones. The leather squelches softly, nothing dramatic, just a medieval oops. The cobbler's shop is nearby. You follow the glow of a small lantern above a swinging sign carved with, what else? A boot. Inside, it's warm. A fire crackles. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old leather. And hanging on the wall behind the counter are documents, not decoration, regulations. Shoemaking in this world isn't some bohemian craft or whimsical hobby. It's law. And the people who enforce it? The guild. Guilds in medieval France were serious business. They regulated quality, labor, prices, and even who could enter the trade. In towns like Toulouse or Rouen, you couldn't just set up shop with a few scraps of hide and a dream. You needed approval, often years of apprenticeship. And yes, you needed to follow the rules, or risk being banned from making so much as a sandal strap. One of the oldest guild ordinances on record, written in shaky Latin and marginally legible French, details not just shoe size and material guidelines, but what days certain shoes could be sold. Want to offer a pair of high boots on a Tuesday? Better have a license. Historians still argue whether these rules were meant primarily to maintain quality or simply to gatekeep the trade. Some say they ensured craftsmanship standards. Others argue it was a power grab, pure and simple, by a bunch of very serious men with very soft hands. The quirkiest bit? Guilds held onto their authority using the most delightfully petty tools, a measuring rod, a wax seal stamp, and in one infamous case from Dijon, a leather paddle used to whack the benches of shoemakers found sleeping on the job. As you wander past the rows of tools, your eyes land on a small pair of pointed shoes resting by the hearth. Ah yes, the iconic poulain, long curled toes, fashionable to some, utterly impractical to everyone else. These shoes were beloved by nobles and hated by guild inspectors, who were tasked with enforcing strict limits on toe length. Too long, and you risked a fine or worse, a forced reshaping. Imagine someone barging into your closet and confiscating your pointy dress shoes. The cobbler here, a hunched man with smudged glasses and a gray apron that may once have been white, sees you admiring the poultry-footed footwear. He chuckles. They paid extra for the extra inches, he says, with what may be a trace of sarcasm. Then they tripped on stairs and broke their dignity. Outside, another bell rings. Curfew approaches. You step back into the street, but this time your feet feel heavier with the weight of invisible regulations, an entire history stitched beneath your soles. A small boy races past, barefoot, and you catch the briefest glimpse of a guild mark branded onto the strap of a discarded sandal near the gutter. Even abandoned shoes here aren't free from bureaucracy. You walk slowly now, listening to the squelch and scrape of your own footsteps and the whisper of the past in every step. You walk a little further now, the street sloping gently downward as the candle-lit windows above you shudder one by one. The night deepens, and so does the scent of tannins and wet stone. You pause under an overhang, just beside a barrel of rainwater and a stack of firewood, watching as the last few townsfolk shuffle home. One woman glances at your shoes, raises an eyebrow, and disappears behind her door, because here people notice footwear, not for the fashion, though that helps, but because in medieval France, shoemaking wasn't just a trade, it was a power structure, a woven web of rules, privileges, and expectations. And at the center of that web sat the Shoemakers Guild. You picture their hall now, a squat, timbered building, slightly crooked with age. Inside, torches flicker along walls hung with banners, emblems stitched with golden awls and silver shoes. And in the front, seated at a long table, are the guild masters. These are not merely cobblers. These are authorities. Guilds in medieval towns like Lyon, Chartres, and Avignon operated much like small governments. They had leadership hierarchies, voting procedures, annual dues, ceremonial feasts, and yes, enforcement officers. You'd call them inspectors, locals called them shoe finders. Historians still argue whether shoemaking guilds were the strictest among French trade organizations. Some point to the smiths as more rigid, others argue the bakers were worse. But there's consensus on this. Shoemakers were deeply involved in regulating how, when, and what people could wear on their feet. Their regulations extended beyond their own work. They dictated which types of shoes could be worn in which quarters of town. Certain areas forbade pointed styles entirely. Other districts had color codes. You couldn't just strut into the market square wearing red boots unless you were nobility or pretending to be. Pretending, by the way, was frowned upon. Pretending got you fined. You lean against the wall now, gazing down at your own boots in the moonlight. Are they soft-soled? You better not be in the merchant quarter. Are they too flat? Someone might think you're a servant. It's a miracle anyone dared leave the house. One particularly quirky rule from 13th century Toulouse specified that shoes made of more than 2 colors of leather were a danger to moral modesty. What exactly that danger entailed is unclear, but presumably someone's feelings got stepped on. To join the guild, one had to apprentice for years under a master shoemaker, but entry wasn't guaranteed. You'd need to craft a masterpiece, a perfect pair of shoes demonstrating skill, artistry, and conformity to the guild's precise regulations. A stitch too long, a sole too stiff, a curve too extravagant? Rejected. Back to sweeping floors and scraping hides. You imagine yourself there now, young and tired, standing in front of a guildmaster who squints at your shoe, turns it over, sniffs it for quality, and utters a single word, "Non." Back to the bench. Guilds didn't just regulate makers. They shaped markets. They determined fair pricing, dictated the number of apprentices a master could employ, and banned unauthorized sales. If you sold a shoe at the Sunday market that hadn't passed inspection, you risked having it confiscated, or worse, public shaming by way of shoe suspension, your product dangled on a stick for everyone to see. Open scholarly debate continues about whether these controls were intended to protect consumers or suppress competition, likely both. The guilds, after all, weren't entirely benevolent. They guarded their privileges like knights guarded castles, with velvet shoes, of course. You step forward again now, across a small stone bridge where the river gurgles quietly below. A piece of torn leather floats past on the current, perhaps the remnant of an unauthorized shoe, discarded in haste, or maybe just trash. Above you, a weathered sign creaks in the wind. It shows a shoe stitched over with the guild's mark, a small iron awl and a thread loop, proof that the town is under their protection and their control. Because here, feet don't just carry you from one place to another. They carry status. They carry compliance. They carry centuries of careful, cobbled regulation. You walk on now, the road narrowing as you approach the part of town that smells less like stew and more like rawhide. It's darker here, quieter, the sort of place where doors creak open only halfway, and most conversations happen with heads down. Welcome to the apprentices' quarter. If you've ever thought about dabbling in medieval shoemaking, maybe in a romantic, Pinterest cottagecore kind of way, prepare yourself. This isn't quaint. This is glue-soaked cloths, blistered fingers, and exactly zero wages. In guild-run towns, becoming a shoemaker wasn't about buying tools and setting up shop. It started with becoming an apprentice, which meant, in modern terms, you were about to do 7 years of unpaid, blister-heavy labor while sleeping above a shop and waking up to the smell of boiling hooves. You duck into a low-ceilinged room, ducking instinctively to avoid the dangling bunches of drying leather scraps. Beneath them, young boys and a few teenaged girls hunched over benches. One stirs a pot of hide glue with a stick that looks suspiciously like a repurposed spoon. Another is vigorously sanding a shoe sole with what may or may not be a bone. There's a faint, rhythmic chant: sand, press, stitch, knot. Your arrival goes unnoticed. Everyone is focused. Becoming a guild shoemaker began not with stitching, but with sweeping. Apprentices were expected to clean the shop, tend the fire, and prepare the materials. For months, sometimes years, they wouldn't be allowed near an actual shoe. First came hide selection, then glue making, and only after that, maybe, a few test stitches on scrap leather. Historians still argue whether the severity of apprenticeships reflected a genuine respect for the craft or simply functioned as a convenient labor system. Either way, they were tough. The guilds controlled entry tightly, often limiting master shoemakers to just 1 or 2 apprentices at a time to preserve quality and avoid flooding the market. One quirky tradition from Rouen required apprentices to pass a test involving both craftsmanship and recitation. Yes, before they could sew a shoe sole, they had to recite a prayer and a guild poem from memory. If they messed up, back to glue duty. Some believe it was to foster discipline. Others suspect the masters just enjoyed hazing. You take a seat on a small wooden stool in the corner of the workshop. It wobbles. Your feet ache sympathetically as you watch a boy trying again and again to thread a needle through 3 layers of leather without bending it. His instructor, a stern woman with calloused thumbs and a sharp eye, silently taps a finger against the table each time he misses. The rhythm becomes hypnotic. Mistap, mistap, thread. No tap, progress. Eventually, if the apprentice endured the years of labor, he or she, though more rarely, could petition the guild to create a masterpiece. This wasn't just a term, it was a literal piece, often a pair of shoes, crafted with flawless technique, correct proportions, and using guild-approved materials. Open scholarly debate continues over whether these masterpieces were preserved in any significant number. Some claim guilds kept archives, others believe they were immediately sold or destroyed, depending on whether the apprentice passed or failed. And yes, many failed. The standards were punishingly precise. An uneven stitch, fail. A misaligned heel, fail. A too soft toe box, fail and try again next year. You peer over a boy's shoulder as he traces a shoe pattern onto parchment. His hands are shaking slightly. His tunic is too thin for the cold. He's probably been at this since dawn. He mutters the chant again, soft and steady. Sand, press, stitch, knot. You remember now the small pile of discarded shoes behind the shop, the ones that didn't pass muster, the ones that bore no guild stamp and would never see a market stall. Every one of them came from someone's hands, hunched at a bench like this. Eventually, if the masterpiece was accepted, the apprentice would become a journeyman, allowed to work, to earn, to travel, but never to open a shop. Not yet. Not until they found a town, a guild, and a master willing to sponsor them as a full-fledged shoemaker. You stand slowly and step back into the night, the chant echoing behind you. Sand, press, stitch, knot. 7 years to learn it, a lifetime to live it. You slip quietly through a side alley now, the sounds of the apprentice workshop fading behind you, replaced by the faint lilt of lute music from a distant tavern and the soft patter of cats patrolling rooftops. The air feels cooler here, still laced with leather, but now you can detect something else. Wool smoke, perhaps, and the subtle aroma of onions frying in goose fat. And yet, you can't stop thinking about your feet because they ache. And after just one night of walking on uneven cobbles in poorly supported shoes, you begin to realize shoemaking wasn't just an art or a business in medieval France. It was also a test of endurance for the wearer and the maker. Enter the apprentice's longest chapter, the 7-year blister. As a journeyman, once your masterpiece had been rejected, you didn't just get to twiddle your thumbs. You went back to the bench, or, if you were lucky, were allowed to shadow a traveling cobbler, learning new techniques, discovering new markets, and ruining your feet on the road. Journeymen often walked from town to town, showing off their stitching, hoping to find a master in need of help. But here's the twist. The shoes they made for themselves were never inspected, which meant they cut corners, which meant blisters. You picture it now, a young man with his tools bundled in waxed cloth, his shoulders hunched under a cloak, his shoes, too thin, soles worn out, the heel on one side flapping ever so slightly as he trudges from town to town, carrying hope and corns in equal measure. Historians still argue whether this wandering phase was designed to humble young cobblers or simply reflect the scarcity of guild openings. Some scholars insist it was a rite of passage, others call it glorified hazing, soaked in foot sweat. Journeymen often slept in barns and tavern kitchens or above the shops of sympathetic masters. One quirky law from Orléans forbade inns from charging cobblers more than 1 sou for a night, provided they offered a shoe inspection in exchange. Yes, a free once-over on the innkeeper's boots bought you a meal and straw to sleep on, but the blister wasn't just physical, it was mental. Returning to your home guild without approval meant starting over. A rejected journeyman might spend years waiting for another chance to present a masterpiece, and during that time, they had to keep their skills sharp, their stitching cleaner than clean, and their souls perfectly aligned. It was like preparing for a test that moved the goalposts every year. One journeyman's diary, discovered in a Parisian cellar centuries later, contained notations about failed masterpiece attempts. Attempt number 3, toe box too soft. Attempt number 4, seam deviated. Attempt number 5, committee was drunk. Whether real or sardonic, it speaks volumes. You pass under a stone archway now, brushing your fingertips along the smooth, worn groove where countless other hands have rested. Above the arch, an engraving. A shoe and a hammer crossed behind a shield, the symbol of the Journeyman's Guild, a loose confederation, not quite as organized as the Masters, but every bit as proud. Journeymen also formed their own associations, complete with secret handshakes, drinking songs, and informal networks to help each other find work. They were the freelancers of their day, armed with needle and knife, always seeking the elusive perfect stitch. Occasionally, a particularly talented journeyman would attract the attention of a noble or a bishop and leapfrog the guild entirely through patronage. But this was rare. Most walked, most bled, most learned the hard way, and yes, they tried everything for relief. Padded soles made from straw and wool, soaking feet in cold vinegar, wrapping toes in wax-dipped linen. One fringe remedy included goat butter, rubbed under the heel, though its effectiveness was questionable, unless your goal was attracting dogs. Open scholarly debate continues about whether this phase produced better shoemakers or simply weeded out the weak. But there's little doubt. Those who persisted developed an intimate understanding of feet, how they moved, how they swelled, how they cracked and blistered and healed. You look down now, wiggling your toes beneath the blanket, grateful for whatever vaguely orthopedic miracle you sleep in today. Because 7 years in medieval footwear, that's not just commitment, that's suffering with stitching. You've now wandered into the merchant quarter, where things begin to gleam just a little, candlelight reflecting off brass-trimmed signage, well-oiled shutters creaking open for the night watch, and the faint jingle of coin purses tucked beneath woolen cloaks. But look down, look closely at their feet. That man striding confidently in the long red cloak. His shoes are nearly a foot long, the toes curling upward like a pair of question marks. He's not alone. Several well-dressed figures here strut with similarly impractical footwear, delicately pointed and arched as if they're walking on punctuation. Welcome to the age of the poulain and the regulations that tried to rein it in. By the mid-14th century, pointed shoes had become the rage among the French upper classes. No longer just about protecting the foot, footwear became a statement, and that statement, increasingly, was look at how absurdly long my toes are. And of course, the Shoemakers' Guild had thoughts. Length restrictions were one of the most obsessively enforced rules among the cobblers of France. Why? Because shoe length was tied to status. A practical, rounded shoe marked you as a laborer. A slight point, a merchant or scribe. A toe that extended several inches past your foot, stuffed with moss or twisted into a little curl. That meant you were rich or trying too hard. Historians still argue whether these length laws originated as a reaction to vanity or as a pragmatic measure to avoid injuries in narrow streets and church aisles. One chronicler dryly noted that long pointed shoes did more harm to kneeling than to walking. The regulations came with great specificity. In Paris, around 1368, guild mandates dictated maximum toe extensions based on social class. Nobles could sport poulins up to 24 inches in length. Knights, 18, merchants, to anyone below that risked a fine, or worse, public ridicule. You glance down at your imaginary polans, now envisioning how on earth anyone navigated stairs or mud with half a baguette sticking out of each foot. Apparently not well. One bishop reportedly banned long shoes from the altar after 3 choristers tripped during a procession. No divine intervention helped their ankles. And the punishments? They were marvelously petty. If a guild inspector found you wearing unlawfully long shoes, they could demand the toes be cut off on the spot. Imagine walking home with your dignity trailing behind you in leather scraps. One particularly quirky tale from Tours tells of a baker's son who wore his father's poulains to impress a girl at market. He was caught, his shoes clipped mid-flirt, and legend says the girl married a butcher instead, one with legal footwear. Even within the guilds, shoemakers chafed at the length rules. Fashion moved faster than legislation, and wealthier clients often demanded longer shoes, regardless of legality. Some cobblers got clever, designing detachable tips so the shoe could pass inspection, then be extended in private. Sneaky, open scholarly debate continues over whether these length restrictions were genuinely enforced beyond city centers. Some believe rural areas ignored them entirely. Others argue that guild pride meant even the smallest towns kept toe measuring rods behind the counter. You turn the corner now into a quieter lane, your own imaginary shoes clicking softly on the stones. You try walking with curled poulains. You try kneeling. You try dancing. It's not going well. You mentally return to your modern sneakers with gratitude. And yet, part of you understands. Long shoes weren't practical, but they were fun. They were loud. They were absurd in the most delightful way. They were medieval high fashion with all the drama and discomfort that entails. So yes, guilds tried to contain the madness, but fashion has a way of walking past the rules, even if it trips on its own feet doing it. You've now wandered back toward the town square, where the last of the oil lamps flicker in their iron cradles, and a few stragglers make their way home. Their cloaks whisper along the stone. Their footsteps echo, but it's their shoes, their colors, more than their shape, that catch your drowsy eye. Because in this era, color doesn't just suggest your mood or your fashion sense. In medieval France, color signals class, and nothing embodied this more bizarrely than the color of your boots. It sounds ridiculous now, but guild regulations went so far as to codify color. Yes, they did. Certain hues were explicitly reserved for certain classes, occupations, or roles in civic life. Step outside your assigned color palette, you were guilty of visual impersonation, social cosplay, if you will. A nobleman might be spotted in rich blue or deep red boots, colors that came from expensive, hard-to-source dyes. Indigo, for example, had to be imported, and that alone meant the dye could cost more than the shoe. So naturally, the guilds stepped in. If your shoes were blue and your title didn't match, someone might come asking questions. Peasants, earth tones only, brown, dusty gray, unambitious green, and even then, only with permitted leather types, goat leather for the working poor. Calfskin only if approved. It wasn't just fashion, it was enforced humility. Historians still argue whether these color rules reflected moral ideals or economic protections. Either way, the result was a rainbow with very sharp fences. One particularly telling ordinance from Lyon declared that no man of trade shall wear shoes of crimson hue unless the fabric be dull and not glossy. Yes, even shine was regulated. A little too much gleam, you risked an accusation of pretension. You pause now beside a merchant's stall, shuttered for the evening. A few stray items hang behind the slats, mostly tools and belts, but there, half hidden, is a pair of green slippers with embroidery. Are they legal? Depends who wears them. You possibly not. Better keep walking. One quirky workaround involved layering. Some wealthier merchants, not quite noble but definitely not poor, had 2 pairs of shoes, one for walking in public and another, often flashier, for indoor events. In one documented case, a merchant hosted a feast where guests left their brown shoes at the door and slipped into forbidden velvet slippers once inside. Technically legal, immensely smug. And yes, there were color controversies. In 1312, a cobbler in Bourges was fined for selling purple boots to a man later discovered to be a farmer. The record notes, the boots were seized, the cobbler scolded, and the farmer instructed to wear them only after sunset. Apparently, even moonlight couldn't redeem poor fashion judgment. Open scholarly debate continues about whether women's shoe colors were equally regulated. Some records are clear. Others are vague. One theory is that women's garments, being longer and more likely to obscure footwear, received slightly less scrutiny. But if your shoes peeked out in the wrong hue at the wrong time, especially in church, you could be in trouble. You imagine now a small group of guild inspectors peering beneath the hem of a cloak, muttering, "Is that ochre on a butcher?" Then furiously scribbling on a wax tablet. The rules extended to clergy as well. Monks wore black or undyed leather. Priests had limited leeway for feast days. Cardinals could, occasionally, slip on a muted red, though they preferred slippers to boots, and always without decoration. And so the guilds, with their ever-expanding list of shoe laws, turned every foot into a walking social message board. You didn't just walk around town. You announced who you were, what you did, and where you ranked, every time you took a step. You tug your blanket tighter now, imagining your feet slipping into the safety of colorless, regulation-free socks. No judgment, no fines, no midnight inspection for inappropriate burgundy. Because in medieval France, a little color could walk you straight into trouble. The moon has shifted higher now, casting soft angles over thatched rooftops and cobblestone lanes polished by centuries of passage. You pause beside a narrow alley where shadows curl like ribboned smoke, and the scent of tanning fluid grows sharper. Ahead, a low door opens into a workshop, just wide enough to drag in a fresh hide. Because now, we turn our attention to the foundation of every regulated shoe, the materials, specifically the strict, fussy, sometimes bizarre rules the guild set about which leathers were allowed, and which were absolutely not. In medieval France, it wasn't enough to simply have access to animal hides. You needed the right hide, from the right animal, processed in the right way, and inspected by the right person. If you failed even one of these steps, your shoe could be deemed unfit for sale, or worse, unworthy of being worn at all. The main contenders, calfskin, goatskin, and pigskin, occasionally deer, sometimes sheep. But even within those categories, there were hierarchies. And calfskin was king, supple, durable, elegant, perfect for upper-class shoes and ceremonial boots. But it wasn't cheap. Goatskin was more affordable, lighter, and often used for indoor slippers or children's shoes. Pigskin, tough, thick, and generally frowned upon for formal wear, great for working shoes, awful for making impressions at court. Historians still argue whether these preferences came from actual material differences or simple class bias. Calfskin, after all, feels more refined, but goatskin wears well. Pigskin lasts forever. Was it fashion or just good branding? And then there were the bans. Guilds often forbade certain types of leather entirely. Donkey hide, for example, was labeled unworthy for town wear in a Parisian ordinance from 1340. The reasons a smell. Even well tanned, donkey leather had a persistent scent that no amount of oil or lavender sachets could mask, also banned any hide that hadn't gone through guild-approved tanneries. You wander deeper into the workshop. A rack of treated hides lines one wall, arranged by sheen and stiffness. In the corner, a heavy vat of tanning solution bubbles faintly. The smell is a strange cocktail, sharp with lime, earthy from bark, and something vaguely medieval. Tanning was a delicate process. Leather that was over-tanned turned brittle. Under-tanned, it stank and rotted, so the guilds demanded precision. Every cobbler had to source their leather from approved tanners, many of whom belonged to separate, but equally strict, leatherworking guilds. A shoemaker caught using unlicensed leather-faced heavy fines, confiscation of goods, or suspension from the market. One quirky regulation from Poitiers insisted that imported hides from unknown lands be marked with a green wax seal before being cut. Whether this was for quality control or xenophobic paranoia is unclear, but the result was unmistakable. If your shoe's sole bore a smudge of green wax, someone was watching. Even the thickness of leather was regulated. Guild inspectors carried measuring tools, not just for toe length, as we've seen, but for sole width. A laborer's shoe needed a thicker sole for durability. A nobleman's slipper, conversely, had to be light and elegant. Getting this balance wrong could mean rejection of an entire batch. Open scholarly debate continues over whether these rules genuinely improved shoe quality or simply provided more ways to control supply, but cobblers, at least publicly, supported them. After all, uniform materials meant uniform expectations and less room for customers to argue. You pause near a workbench where two mismatched shoes rest. One glows with polished calfskin, the other dull and pebbled with goat grain. A candle guttering beside them casts flickers of gold across the laces. You imagine trying to sell both at market, the customer eyeing them suspiciously. You'll want the left one, you'd say. The right's only for rainy days. And the dyes? Regulated too. Natural plant dyes were acceptable. Walnut, oak, madder root, but anything too experimental, too vivid, or not properly fixed to the hide was considered risky. There's a record of a shoemaker in Avignon being scolded for trying to use beetroot juice. The result? A pair of blotchy pink slippers that bled onto the wearer's socks. One last oddity. During plague years, some cities briefly allowed shoes made from untanned leather, thinking that the softer material would prevent miasmic air from settling in the cracks. It didn't work, and those shoes dissolved in rain. You step back outside now, your nostrils still tingling with the ghosts of tannins and lime. You feel the weight of it all, the hides, the hammers, the hierarchy. Because here, even what you walked on was watched. And if you chose poorly, well, it wasn't just a fashion mistake. It was a guild violation. You're halfway down Rue des Tanneurs now, where the leather shops thin out and give way to quieter storefronts, candle makers, spice stalls, a lonely-looking tailor with bolts of linen sagging in the window. It's calm here, almost sleepy, until you glance sideways and spot something absurd. A boot with 3 shiny buttons running down the outer ankle. They sparkle faintly in the moonlight, and suddenly you remember the button ban of 1294. Yes, really. There was a time, brief and bewildering, when buttons on shoes were not just frowned upon in medieval France, they were prohibited. You pause, picturing a stern guildmaster in full regalia shaking his fist at a cobbler holding up a decorated boot, horrified not by the stitchwork or the material, but by the sheer audacity of ornamental buttons. Historians still argue whether this bizarre ban came from a moral objection to vanity or simply from guild conservatism. Buttons were a relatively new invention in Europe at the time, and their sudden popularity, especially among wealthier classes, caused a stir. Shoemakers, it seemed, didn't appreciate their role creeping into fashion. You see, buttons had functioned for centuries in Asia and North Africa, but they were only just becoming popular in 13th century Europe. Tailors were beginning to use them on sleeves and tunics, and some particularly bold cobblers thought, why not shoes? Big mistake. The button ban of 1294, issued by a coalition of shoemaking guilds in northern France, stated that no fastener of round shape or of reflective sheen shall be affixed to footwear for the purpose of show. That's medieval legalese for, if it sparkles and doesn't do anything, take it off. One quirky side note, the law allowed exceptions for buttons that actually functioned, say securing a flap over the instep. But these had to be made of natural, non-luxurious materials. Think wood, horn, or bone. No gilded brass, no polished jet, no little bits of mother of pearl shaped like flowers. That's peacocking. Guild inspectors began patrolling markets, examining boots for contraband buttons. Imagine the scene: a cobbler nervously laying out his wares, praying no one lifts the heel flap and sees the tiny decorative studs sewn just for flair. Customers occasionally tried to bribe inspectors with wine or, deliciously ironic, new shoes. The success rate was variable. You walk past a shoemaker's stall now, long shuttered for the night. Hanging behind a curtain, just visible through a crack in the boards, you spot a pair of ankle boots, plain at first glance, but if you squint, there, near the seam, 2 discreet leather circles, buttons or decoration, who knows? But if it's 1294 again, someone's in trouble. Open scholarly debate continues about whether the ban was widely enforced or just symbolic. Some argue it was more about setting tone than punishing actual cobblers. Others point to surviving records of fines and even confiscated shoes. A boot belonging to a merchant's wife in Tours was famously paraded through the square, hung from a wooden stick, its offending buttons blacked out with tar. Her reaction is not recorded, but one imagines she wasn't thrilled the ban didn't last long. By the early 1300s, as clothing trends shifted and buttons became more functional, the guilds relented gradually. Some towns lifted the ban first for women's shoes, citing reasonable need for adornment. Others allowed buttons only on ceremonial footwear. Eventually, practicality won out. But for a time, that little round fastener caused more outrage than any pointed toe or mismatched lace. You let your gaze fall to your own imaginary boots again. One button, just one. You could claim it's functional. You could make it out of horn. You could pass inspection, probably. But you smile to yourself and tuck that imaginary boot under your cloak anyway, just in case someone with a measuring rod and an attitude walks by, because when it comes to guild law, even the tiniest button can trip you up. Your path now winds gently along a quieter lane, cobbles muffled beneath a scattering of straw. Somewhere nearby, a bakery has closed for the night, but the scent of flour and ash lingers sweetly. You pause by a public notice board, its surface rough with layers of parchment, wax seals, and guild stamps. And there, half torn, flapping softly in the breeze, is one of the most delightfully bureaucratic things you'll see all night, a shoe tax chart. Welcome to the curious tale of the toe tax. Yes, in certain medieval French towns, the guilds not only regulated what shoes could be worn, they also taxed them, and not by pair, not by heel, and not even by size. No, the most bewildering system of all, by number of toes covered. It sounds absurd, and frankly it was, but it happened. Historians still argue whether this was an actual widespread practice or a hyper-local experiment in towns desperate for revenue. But evidence exists, especially from Dijon and parts of Champagne, of municipal ordinances declaring that shoe taxes would be levied per toe enclosed in footwear. So, if you had a basic shoe covering all 10 toes, 10-toe tax. Wearing open sandals, fewer toes covered, lower tax. And if you were a particularly rich noble with double-toed shoes, that is, the kind that included a pointed poulain with a false toe extension, you might be taxed even more. The logic, if you could afford fake toes, you could afford fake taxes. You crouch now beside a public bench, worn smooth by time. Beneath it, someone's lost slipper peeks out, missing its fastening. You count the space at the front, 4 toe boxes, then a flattened edge. Maybe it belonged to a child, maybe to someone trying to save on taxes. One quirky account from Troyes tells of a merchant who trimmed the front of his shoes into a scalloped, semi-open design, leaving the big toes peeking out, purely to avoid the full rate. The guild responded by updating the ordinance. Toes partially exposed shall still be considered covered if shoe structure encloses said digits to more than half their height. That's right, they measured toe height. Open scholarly debate continues on how exactly these inspections were carried out. Did someone truly peer down at your feet and count toes? Were there guild-issued toe diagrams, measuring tools? There's no surveying instruction manual, but surely some poor apprentice had to do the counting. Of course, the tax system also created room for scams. Shoemakers started marketing low-tax designs, open-toe shoes styled just enough to feel fashionable, but with strategic gaps at the front. Some clients requested slippers that left the little toe entirely exposed, hoping to shave off a fraction of the fee. It rarely worked. And then there were the loopholes, literally. One notorious tailor-shoemaker hybrid in Lyon offered a toe veil, a thin scrap of gauze draped across the open toes, allowing the wearer to claim full coverage without the leather to match. The guild declared this a mockery of both law and common sense, and outlawed the practice within a week. You walk on, amused now by the mental image of a medieval bureaucrat perched at a market stall with a stylus and a bored expression. Name, occupation, toe count? The tax wasn't universal, of course. Many rural towns ignored it entirely, relying instead on flat market fees or standard shoemaker dues. But in the wealthier trading cities, where civic coffers mattered and fashion reigned, the toe tax flourished for a time. Eventually, as shoe designs evolved and lacing replaced full enclosures, the toe tax lost practicality. Inspectors found it increasingly difficult to assess coverage as shoes became more elaborate. By the late 1300s, most guilds phased out the practice, replacing it with standard pair-based tariffs or license fees. Still, you can't help but marvel at the ingenuity, if not the logic, of the system. Imagine adjusting your footwear not for comfort, but for toe economics. You stop now near a fountain, the water trickling softly in the moonlight. You slip off your imaginary shoe and wiggle your toes in the cool air, grateful, deeply, inexplicably grateful that no one is watching, no one is counting, no one will charge you per digit, because tonight your toes are free. You've wandered into the heart of the town now, where the square opens beneath the stars and shadows gather gently beneath wooden eaves. A cluster of sleeping geese honk softly from the far corner, unaware they're blocking the entrance to a tailor's alley. But just beyond them, there's a sound you weren't expecting. A giggle, then a thud. You peer around the corner and pause. Two boys, apprentices by the look of their smocks, are breathless from laughter. One clutches something behind his back, and the other is red-faced, hopping on one foot. And that's when you realize they were trying to have a pillow fight, but with shoes. And as it turns out, this isn't just a prank, it's forbidden. Not just because of mischief, but because shoes were too precious, too regulated, and far too carefully constructed to ever be used so recklessly. In medieval France, a shoe fight was sacrilege. You quietly recall one of the guild rules from Avignon. No member shall cast footwear in jest, be it among brothers or strangers, lest damage befall the structure thereof. That's right. Throwing a shoe wasn't just dangerous. It was a direct offense to craftsmanship. This wasn't a world where people casually tossed loafers across the room. Every pair represented hours of effort, a string of approvals, and possibly attacks. To throw one, to beat someone with one, to use it as a toy, blasphemy. Even children's shoes were protected, made smaller, sure, but still crafted under guild laws. Leather had to be soft but durable. Closures had to be safe. Decorative flourishes were regulated by age and class. That meant no jingling bells unless it was a feast day, and never, under any circumstances, were they to be used as projectiles. Historians still argue whether such strict rules around shoe respect were a matter of economics or honor. Some believe the cobbler's pride in his work led to this sense of sanctity. Others suspect it was simply about preventing returns. And yet, despite the rules, the temptation was real. A 1328 court record from Lyon describes a pair of students who, during a grammar lesson, removed their clogs and used them to bat at each other under the table. The result, one broken clasp, two scolded boys, and a furious cobbler demanding restitution for misuse of goods. You step closer now and glance at the boys, still chuckling under the arch. One holds what looks like a worn practice shoe. No sole, no lining, just a stitched upper, not meant for wear, possibly discarded. They're lucky. If they'd done this in public, under the nose of a guild inspector, there would be a fine, or worse, an embarrassing apology to the maker. The guilds even regulated how shoes were stored, especially in merchant shops. Shoes couldn't be hung by their laces, lest the leather warp. They couldn't be stacked more than 3 pairs high, and using them as doorstops? Unthinkable. That was like using a tapestry as a bath towel. One particularly quirky rule from Béziers forbade taverns from displaying abandoned shoes as decorations. Apparently, a local trend had begun where mismatched shoes were nailed above the hearth, each one a supposed lost and found tale. The guilds responded with a public statement: "Let not the tools of our labor become ornaments of folly." You smile at that, ornaments of folly, as you watch the two boys tuck the practice shoe away and scurry off. One limps dramatically, the other shushes him. They vanish into the side street, the moment gone, and in their wake, silence. You walk a little further now, your own footsteps soft and measured. Each shoe hits the stone with quiet precision, and you become acutely aware that even these imaginary shoes would have been inspected, weighed, approved. To joke with them, to weaponize them even playfully, was to risk the wrath of a profession that took its role very seriously. Open scholarly debate continues about whether these behavioral restrictions were ever truly internalized or just handed down like stern bedtime warnings. Don't throw your shoe or the guild will find out. Still, you find yourself walking with extra care now, because in medieval France, even your mischief was subject to regulation, and your shoes, they were not for flinging. You make your way toward the outskirts of town now, where the buildings grow sparser and the moonlight stretches out across long hedgerows and rolling pasture. It's quiet enough to hear your own breathing and the gentle creak of your shoes as the leather folds with each step. You notice the silence, yes, but also the absence of something else. No jingling spurs, no dramatic boots, no clatter of flamboyant heels, because in this corner of medieval France, footwear volume was just as closely policed as its length, shape, and color. Enter the fascinatingly odd world of sound-based regulations. Yesod guilds didn't just mind how shoes looked, they also had thoughts on how they sounded. In larger towns like Rouen and Paris, cobblers were expected to construct shoes that adhered to rules about volume, how much noise a shoe made while walking, and when. This was particularly enforced during religious observances, civic ceremonies, and in proximity to sleeping nobility. If your shoes clicked too loudly on a quiet morning, you might find yourself politely fined, or not so politely hissed at by a guild inspector with far too much time on his hands. Historians still argue whether these sound ordinances originated with monastic customs, where silence was considered sacred, or with aristocratic habits that favored quietude as a sign of refinement. Either way, the shoemaking guilds took note. One particularly quirky statute from Bordeaux stated, "No sole shall be affixed so as to produce clack or clop within the limits of the cathedral square after the bell of 10th hour. That is, don't you dare show up for evening vespers in loud shoes. You step softly now, imagining yourself on that very square, toes curled in your boots to muffle each step. Are your heels too stiff? Your sole too dry? Better hope not. Some cobblers would coat the underside of their shoes with a layer of felt to soften the sound. Others, especially those crafting slippers for noble clients, used cork inserts or padded leather to keep things hushed. This obsession with quiet reached its peak in courtly environments. In royal households, especially during the reigns of particularly sleep-sensitive monarchs, shoemakers were commissioned specifically for whispering shoes, a term that genuinely appears in at least 2 guild records from the early 15th century. Whispering shoes had flexible soles, oiled joints, and soft tied closures that produced minimal noise. The goal, maximum discretion. Imagine trying to deliver a message to the queen's chamber without waking the entire palace. Your shoes weren't just footwear, they were stealth equipment, open scholarly debate continues about whether whispering shoes were a widely adopted item or a niche fashion limited to upper-class espionage and lovers sneaking across cold castle floors. Either way, their mere existence confirms one thing: silence was golden, especially underfoot. Of course, not everyone obeyed. In bustling market towns, louder shoes were a feature, not a floss. Merchants wanted to be noticed. One merchant in Marseille reportedly wore shoes with tiny bronze plates under the heels to produce a deliberate click as he walked, announcing himself before he even rounded the corner. Predictably, the guild didn't love this. They labeled the shoes clatter boots and began inspecting heel construction more frequently. If your shoe made noise and wasn't approved, fined, confiscated, sometimes publicly mocked. Because yes, in medieval towns, shoe shame was real. You arrive now at a tiny chapel tucked between the trees, its door half open. You peek inside. Wooden pews, a flickering candle, and absolute stillness. This is a place where shoes should tread softly. You step inside, carefully, slowly. Your boots make no sound, just as the guild would want. You step out of the little chapel, the wood floor still echoing faintly in your imagination as you return to the cool night air. It's quieter than ever now. Even the geese have gone silent. You continue along a winding lane, flanked by hedges and herb gardens, and soon arrive at a modest stone building with a peculiar wooden sign hanging above the lintel, a shoe half open beside a loaf of bread. It's not a cobbler's shop, it's a guild charity house, because not all the shoe talk in medieval France was about regulations, punishments, or prestige. Some of it, believe it or not, was about generosity. Tonight, you've stumbled upon one of the lesser-known functions of the Shoemakers Guild, almsgiving. Guilds didn't just police their craft, they also supported their own, especially those who fell on hard times. It was part tradition and part social insurance and part reputation maintenance. After all, what good is a respected institution if it ignores the apprentice with a broken wrist or the widow of a master cobbler? Inside this house, by the warmth of a low-burning hearth, you'd find a few beds, a basket of lentils, maybe a chunk of bread, and, neatly stacked in the corner, a shelf of donated shoes made specifically for the poor. This practice, often called cordonnerie de charité in the guild records, wasn't just about clearing out unwanted stock. These were purpose-built shoes, constructed from simpler materials, using leftover leather and made to fit more loosely, since exact sizing was rarely possible. Historians still argue whether this charity was truly altruistic or merely a means of appeasing civic leaders and church officials. But records show regular donation quotas. Masters were expected to contribute at least 3 pairs per season, apprentices 1. The shoes were then distributed at key moments, especially before winter and major feast days. You crouch now beside the stack, running your fingers along the edges of the leather. Some are rough, others surprisingly refined. One pair even has an embroidered cross stitched near the ankle, a quiet nod to the guild's spiritual obligations. The recipients of these shoes varied: orphans, elderly laborers, wayfarers passing through town with no guild of their own. In some cases, monks served as intermediaries, placing shoe requests on behalf of the needy. In others, the poor lined up directly outside the guild hall, holding up worn-out clogs like supplicants with cracked soles and quiet dignity. One quirky anecdote from Nimes tells of a boy who, upon receiving his charity shoes, refused to wear them out of fear he'd get them dirty. For 3 days he walked barefoot, carrying the shoes like holy relics. Eventually, the town priest convinced him that shoes, even gifted ones, were meant to be walked in. You smile at that, and the guild took care of more than just shoes. Some records mention food stipends, small coins, even medical help for those who'd been injured while working with sharp tools. Widows' pensions were not uncommon either. If a master died mid-contract, his wife might receive temporary supports, so long as she didn't try to run the shop herself. That, of course, was not allowed. Open scholarly debate continues about how universal this aid was. Some towns went above and beyond, while others seemed to give only when watched. Still, the presence of these charity houses in guild records suggests a consistent, if modest, system of care, a safety net, cobbled together one stitch at a time. You rise and look once more at the shelf of shoes, each one different, each one a quiet offering. They weren't fancy. They weren't inspected with measuring rods or dyed with expensive colors, but they were made with purpose, with dignity, with the same tools used for nobles' boots and ceremonial slippers. Because even in a world obsessed with rules and status, someone still thought everyone deserves a warm foot in winter. You walk on now, lighter somehow, as if your own shoes carry not just your steps, but the memory of all those who made, gave, or received theirs. The sky above you has shifted now, velvet black and crowded with stars, the moon climbing higher like a polished coin resting in the palm of the heavens. You stroll quietly down a lane that smells faintly of soot and soap, past shuttered windows and snoring dogs, until you reach a plaza with stone benches and a peculiar statue at its center. A man holding a shoe, and not just any shoe, an absurdly wide one, the toes splayed, the sole twice the width of anything that might reasonably be worn. This, dear wanderer, is your introduction to the most controversial footwear of its time, the wide shoe scandal. Yes, long before Crocs, medieval France had its own moment of podiatric panic, when some shoemakers began producing excessively wide shoes for reasons no one quite agreed on. Some say it was to accommodate new fashions in hose and padding. Others whisper it was to disguise bunions. A few more cynical chroniclers suggest it was merely to use more leather and charge more coin. Historians still argue whether this movement began in Paris or Angers, but by the early 1400s, wide shoes were making their presence known, literally. They squeaked, flapped, and dragged. A man couldn't cross the church nave without disturbing half the congregation. Naturally, the guilds were horrified. The shoemakers of Tours were among the first to push back, issuing ordinances that defined acceptable sole widths by occupation. A baker, 3 finger widths. A scholar, 2. Nobles got a bit more leeway, of course, but no one, under any circumstances, was permitted to wear shoes with soles that extended more than a half palm beyond the natural outline of the foot. Half a palm, not a whole palm. That would be madness. You sit now on the edge of a bench and glance down at your own imaginary shoes. How far do they extend? Can you stack a goose feather between the edge of your foot and the leather rim? If yes, you're within code. If no, well, prepare to be fined, and yes, people did cheat. A cobbler in Reims was accused of crafting wide shoes with inward folded linings to hide the true sole width. Inspectors reportedly sliced open the shoes at the market stall and revealed the forbidden girth. Scandalous. One quirky trend that followed was the false narrow, a shoe with a normal upper, but an invisible flare at the base. Think platforms, but sideways. The guilds were not amused. They responded by issuing a truly remarkable tool, the Soul Stencil. Carried by inspectors, it was a wooden cutout shaped like an average foot, used to test whether a shoe was overly generous. If your sole couldn't fit neatly within the stencil's boundaries, it was declared puffed and unfit for sale. Open scholarly debate continues on whether this obsession with width was practical. After all, wide shoes were terrible in muddy towns, or simply a reflection of deeper anxieties about decadence and vanity. After all, a wide shoe took more leather, cost more, and signaled that you didn't expect to do much walking. A peasant's shoe hugged the foot. A lord's, it strutted. One guild ordinance even referenced this directly. Let not the width of one's shoe exceed the width of one's duty. Poetic and deeply confusing. You wander now toward the base of the statue, where the absurd shoe is cracked, its toe mossy, its width still ridiculous. It looks like something between a canoe and a roast platter. You imagine trying to run in that, or dance, or simply walk. It would be like tying boards to your feet and hoping for the best. Still, there was flair to it, a kind of slow, deliberate elegance, like saying, I don't need to walk fast, I'm already important. You move on again, your imaginary soles clicking softly, a perfect width, not too narrow, not too wide, just right. Because tonight, in the realm of medieval guild law, it pays to toe the line, literally. The breeze picks up gently now, carrying with it the scent of late-blooming herbs and something faintly acrid, perhaps a chimney's dying breath or the tang of boiled dye. You pass an arched doorway with fading blue paint and pause as your eye catches a burst of color in the gloom, a pair of shoes resting on a windowsill, glinting faintly, not just any shoes, velvet shoes, and beside them, what looks like a delicate twist of something lacy. You sigh knowingly because you've just stumbled upon the highly suspect, occasionally scandalous world of outlawed laces and velvet fines. It's hard to imagine a piece of thread could cause so much trouble, but in medieval France, laces were about more than fastening. They were flair, they were decadence, and sometimes they were deception, and that meant the guilds had feelings. Let's begin with velvet. Velvet, you see, wasn't just soft and expensive. It was symbolic. It whispered of nobility, of leisure, of my family has land and no one tells me to milk goats. Velvet shoes, or shoes even trimmed with velvet, were tightly regulated. Guild laws in Paris and Toulouse specifically restricted the use of velvet to the upper nobility and clergy. Even the wealthiest merchants were, by rule, barred from using it unless they had explicit permission. Some shoemakers got around this by using extremely fine brushed wool and calling it peasant velvet. Others didn't even try. They just hoped no one noticed. And when they did, the velvet fine was steep. In one instance, a cobbler in Rouen was fined an entire month's earnings for making a pair of wedding slippers lined with plum-colored velvet for the daughter of a spice trader. The shoes were seized. The girl cried. The spice trader offered the inspector free clothes. No word on whether it worked. Historians still argue whether these velvet restrictions were about protecting class hierarchy or about controlling imports, since real velvet had to be brought in from Italy or the East and was taxed heavily. Either way, the result was clear. If your shoes were too soft and too shiny, expect a knock at the door, and then there were the laces. Shoes in the earlier medieval period didn't typically have what we think of as laces. They were buckled, toggled, wrapped, or simply slipped on. But by the 14th century, decorative lacing had begun to appear, often threaded through eyelets or wrapped around ankles, sometimes crisscrossing all the way up the calf like tiny leather serpents. And oh, the guilds hated it. One ordinance from Dijon referred to laced shoes as exaggerated trappings of vanity, fit only for actors and fools, which, to be honest, makes them sound pretty fun. The problem wasn't the function, it was the showmanship. Laces added a layer of personality. They allowed for custom designs. They gave the wearer control. And in a society obsessed with hierarchy, the idea that someone might lace their own shoes in a novel way was deeply unsettling. Guilds responded with rules. Lace width was regulated. The number of eyelets was limited, 6 per side maximum. Some towns even restricted lacing to even-numbered patterns only, which remains one of the most bizarrely specific and completely unenforceable rules in recorded footwear history. Open scholarly debate continues over whether these lace laws were seriously enforced or just symbolic bluster. One scholar suggests they were more about giving inspectors leverage. Another points to preserved records showing confiscated laced shoes held up at market as cautionary tales. Either way, laces became a quiet rebellion. People got creative. They hid lace patterns under flaps. They used matching colors to avoid detection. They even stitched false seams to give the illusion of a simpler shoe. One tailor was caught hiding an illegal gold thread lace under a layer of common twine. For ceremony only, he explained. The guild was unmoved. You step away from the window now, leaving the velvet shoes behind, their soft shine dimmed in the starlight. You imagine slipping them on. Imagine the forbidden laces curling over your ankle like ivy. You imagine walking past a guild inspector with a poker face so convincing it deserves an award. And then you imagine the fine, because in medieval France, there was no such thing as just for flair. If your shoes whispered secrets in velvet and lace, the guilds would hear them loud and clear. You follow a gentle slope now, winding through the slumbering edge of the city, where lamp oil is running low, and even the rats sound tired. Your steps echo faintly off shuttered storefronts, and then just ahead, you spot a dim shape hunched near a stall. A man, short, stocky, bundled in a guild-marked cloak, holding what appears to be a mallet. You've met the most feared figure in the shoemaking world, the guild shoe inspector, and yes, he carries a hammer, not for cobbling, for testing. Tonight, we delve into the bizarre and bureaucratic realm of the shoe inspectors and their tiny hammers, those officials appointed by the guilds to ensure every shoe on the market, every boot on a noble's foot, every slipper in a festival booth met the ironclad regulations of the shoemaking trade. You pause in the shadow of a grapevine-covered post, watching the man in action. He lifts a boot, studies the seams, gives the sole a firm tap with the hammer. Not once, but 3 times. Not tap, tap, tap. It's the medieval equivalent of a shoe polygraph. What exactly is he testing for? Sound, dot, flexibility, density, seam strength. Guild inspectors were trained to recognize faults invisible to the average eye. They knew when a stitch was loose, when leather was stretched thin, when a false lining had been used to pass off goat as calf. Some even claimed to sniff out improperly cured leather. One account from Bordeaux describes an inspector who could identify pigskin by scent alone from 5 paces. The hammer, that was mostly for show and intimidation. It was used to test stiffness, yes, but also as a symbol, an echo of authority in the echo of your step. Historians still argue whether the inspector role was born out of genuine quality control or guild paranoia, possibly both. As shoemaking became more competitive, ensuring uniform standards helped protect prices, reputations, and that all-important sense of professional pride. Each town had its own inspection ritual. In Reims, shoe inspectors performed weekly rounds at the open-air market, checking merchant stalls and workshop windows. In Avignon, inspections took place at dawn on Mondays, always unannounced. In Paris, a rogue inspector once conducted spot checks during Mass, which led to a furious priest and a brief ban on Sunday patrols. You move closer now, listening as the inspector mutters to himself while thumbing a sole. 2 seams, not 3, he whispers. Tallow finish instead of beeswax. Then comes another hammer tap. This one echoes off a wooden column, like a sleepy exclamation point, one quirky note. Inspectors carried more than hammers. Many also carried measuring rods, often notched with maximum and minimum dimensions, allowed for heels, soles, and toe extensions. These rods were standardized, passed down between inspectors, sometimes carved with tiny decorative flourishes. A few have survived in museums. They're oddly beautiful and undeniably petty. Shoemakers both feared and resented inspections. Some tried to bribe their way through, offering food, ale, or coin. Others simply hid their more ambitious designs on inspection days. A few tried tricks, reversible uppers, detachable flaps, even second soles stitched inside the first to mask poor quality. Inspectors took it personally. One report from Toulouse claims a particularly zealous official once bit into a shoe's seam to prove it was glued instead of stitched. Open scholarly debate continues over whether shoe inspectors were genuinely respected or simply tolerated. Their power was real, but their popularity, not so much. Still, for all their fussiness, many guilds treated inspectors with reverence. They were, after all, protectors of the trade, guardians of the craft, the last line of defense between a good cobbler and a customer with buyer's remorse. The inspector before you now finishes his rounds. He jots something down on a wax tablet, tucks it into his belt, and vanishes into the night, his hammer swaying gently at his side. You let out a breath. Your own shoes, thankfully imaginary, remain untested. But if they weren't, would you pass? Would the hammer sound soft and sure? Or would it echo with doubt? The town feels emptier now, as if your footsteps alone animate the cobbled streets. The last candles have guttered out behind windows. Shutters creak on their hinges, and cats patrol with the solemn authority only cats possess. You find yourself meandering past the quieter homes, those belonging not to merchants or nobles, but to the quiet lifeblood of the guild system, the apprentices. And tonight, you drift into the story of shoe apprenticeships, those years of toe-crunching labor, needle-pricked fingers, and regulated yawns where a young hopeful earned their right to someday stitch a sole without supervision. Because in medieval France, becoming a shoemaker wasn't just about picking up a needle and hammer. It was about lineage, oaths, and time. Years of it. Often 7, the journey began with a contract. A boy, usually aged 11 to 14, though sometimes younger, would be handed over by his parents to a master shoemaker. This contract, often sealed by the guild itself, detailed every expectation, years of service, behavior, hours of work, rules of conduct, even what the apprentice could wear. And yes, that included shoes. Apprentices weren't allowed to wear anything fancy. Plain leather, No dyed trim, no decorative stitches. In some towns, apprentice shoes had to be visibly marked. An extra seam, a crooked stitch, even a small notch at the toe, so the public would know not to judge the master's quality based on junior handiwork. Historians still argue whether this practice of visibly marking apprentice shoes was a necessary protection for guild reputations, or just a clever way of making sure nobody tried to pass off practice pairs as polished product. You peer through a sliver in a wooden door now, and inside you see a boy curled beside a hearth, cradling a half-finished shoe like a sleeping pet. Tools lie scattered around him, awls, punches, lengths of waxed thread. The shape of tomorrow's shoe is already rising from today's blisters. The apprentice's days were long, sunrise to sunset and then some. Duties ranged from sweeping floors and fetching water to stretching hides and preparing glue. Only gradually would he be allowed to stitch, and even then, only under watchful eyes. Open scholarly debate continues about the balance between training and exploitation. Some masters were fair, treating their apprentices like family. Others were tyrannical, doling out impossible quotas, scolding for uneven stitches, rationing meals. One notorious master in Limoges was fined for making his apprentice work by moonlight, claiming that real skill grows in dim light. The boy later became a priest. Apprenticeship wasn't all drudgery, though. There were feast days, occasional bonuses, the right, after a few years, to make a test pair, your first full shoes from start to finish. If the pair held up during inspection, you earned praise. If it fell apart, back to stitching linings. One quirky tradition held that an apprentice's final test involved crafting shoes for someone they hated. The logic? If you can make good shoes for someone you don't like, you're truly ready for the public. You imagine now the nervousness of that moment. Your mentor standing over you, arms folded, a half smile hidden beneath his beard. The guild inspector ready with his measuring rod. Maybe even the recipient waiting nearby, arms crossed. You place the shoes down, you wait, you hope, and then a nod or a hammer tap. And that's how you moved from apprentice to journeyman. Journeymen could work for wages, travel between towns, and even take on small contracts. But until you submitted your masterwork, a pair of shoes deemed perfect by the guild, you remained just that, a journeyman, walking in someone else's shadow. You continue down the lane now, the moon brushing the rooftops like a slow caress. You pass by rows of dormer windows and low doorways, behind which a dozen apprentices dream of shoes, of approval, of the day they'll stitch their names into the soles, not just their sweat. Because in medieval France, even greatness began with one uneven stitch and a very long week. The road narrows again, slipping between tall walls crusted with ivy, leading you toward the older quarters, places where the mortar predates memories, and even the shadows seem dusted with cobwebs. You duck beneath a low lintel, emerging into a crooked courtyard cluttered with barrels, rags, and one particularly stubborn chicken glaring at you from atop a shoe form, because tonight we tiptoe into the practical, pungent, and faintly ridiculous world of shoe maintenance in medieval France. It's easy to romanticize the making of shoes, all that craftsmanship and regulation, the pride of the guild, the apprentice drama. But what happens after a shoe is made, when it gets muddy, worn, soggy with winter slush, or chewed by someone's dog? That's where maintenance and more rules come in. First, there's polishing. Not the clear, fruity smelling kind you find in little tins today, but an ancient, smelly mixture of animal fat, soot, and sometimes crushed walnut hulls, applied with fingers, cloth, or, if you were very fancy, a badger hairbrush. The result was serviceable, shiny, in a deeply matte sort of way, waterproofish. Guilds required shoes to be treated before market sale. That meant they had to be at least pretending to resist weather, but once in a customer's hands, or rather on their feet, care was the buyer's job, except in some cases. Historians still argue whether cobblers were obligated to offer maintenance. Some records suggest wealthier clients expected a kind of medieval warranty. Bring back your cracked heel or your fraying lace, and the cobbler would patch it, grumbling perhaps, but patch it nonetheless. Others say maintenance was strictly the realm of cordonniers de ruelle, alleyway cobblers, and independent fixers who weren't full guild members. They operated outside the guild's control, setting up tiny repair stands in shady corners or on church steps. Naturally, the guilds despised them. Open scholarly debate continues about how tolerated these rogue repairers were. In some cities, they were chased off. In others, ignored as a necessary evil. One town in Burgundy tried licensing them, only to abandon the plan after discovering no one wanted to pay extra for permission to fix broken shoes. Then there were the more unusual solutions. One curious remedy for cracked soles involved soaking the shoe overnight in boiled flax water, then stuffing it with warm ash. It sounds like a witch's recipe, but apparently it worked for a while. Other methods included beeswax rubs, fish oil soaks, and a bizarre practice in the Pyrenees of storing shoes near warm stones to re-knit the leather. You lean against a stone wall now, watching a ghost of a figure, someone from memory not present, bend over a warped boot, muttering, smearing it with tallow, and murmuring prayers to Saint Crispin, the patron saint of cobblers. Whether the saint approved of fish oil shoes is anyone's guess. The guilds also regulated when shoes could no longer be repaired. After a certain number of patches, a shoe was deemed fatigué, not tired like you or I, but officially worn out. Selling a fatigued shoe as refurbished was a serious offense. Some merchants tried anyway, slapping a fresh buckle on a cracked heel and hoping no one noticed. One quirky workaround involved using old shoes as patterns. Cobblers were allowed to keep expired shoes in their shops, displayed like anatomical models to demonstrate stitching techniques. Customers, however, often mistook them for sale and tried to haggle. One record from Marseille notes an argument in which a woman insisted on buying a 3-patch shoe for market price because it fits and I like the buckle. You walk past a tiny shuttered workshop now where a sign reads Cordonnerie discrète. Beneath it, scratched faintly into the wood, repairs without judgment. That seems fair, because really, in a world of endless walking, muddy roads, and seasonal shoe taxes, who among us hasn't dragged a boot a little too long? You feel the soft wear in your imaginary soles, the gentle give of leather shaped to your stride. Not new, not ruined, just lived in. And as the chicken hops down from the shoe form and disappears into the shadows, you carry that thought with you. That sometimes, even the best-made shoes just need a little warmth, a little wax, and someone who knows how to listen to the squeak. The night has aged gently around you now. The air holds that tender chill just before dawn, when every stone feels damp and the stars begin to blur at the edges. You wander into a quieter district still, one less lit by lanterns, more by devotion. The cobbles here are smoother, the houses squatter, and the silences of the deep, cloistered kind. You've reached the monastic quarter, and with it, one of the strangest loopholes in the guild world: monks, boots, and loopholes. Because while the shoemaking guilds of medieval France regulated just about everything that could cover a foot, from velvet to lace, goat hide to cork, they faced a particularly curious challenge when it came to the holy orders. Yes, monks. Technically, most monks were not shoemakers. They weren't guild members. They didn't serve apprenticeships, and they certainly weren't required to submit their sandals for toe tax inspection. But here's the twist. They made their own shoes, a lot of them. In fact, some monasteries had full-fledged workshops, complete with tools, tanners, and skilled hands trained not through guild rules, but under vows of silence and daily prayer. You enter now a narrow courtyard bordered by low walls and humble doorways. The smell here is different: less glue and dye, more beeswax and hay. Somewhere a wooden mallet taps in rhythm, not the crisp strike of a market cobbler, but the slow, patient knock of someone shaping a soul, and oh soul. Historians still argue whether monastic shoemaking was tolerated, ignored, or resented by the guilds. On paper, monks were exempt from many civic laws. Their work was internal use only, meaning as long as the shoes stayed inside the monastery, no harm done. But of course, they didn't always stay inside. There are records from Carcassonne and Avignon describing disputes where monastic shoes turned up at local markets, passed off by friendly lay brothers as donations or gifts. In truth, they were likely low-cost competition, and the guilds didn't appreciate the loophole. One guild ordinance from Toulouse called the monastic shoemakers unregulated souls with unlicensed souls, which frankly is the best passive-aggressive line in medieval bureaucracy. Still, the monks were clever. One clever workaround involved labeling their shoes as liturgical garb, not market items. And since religious dress wasn't regulated by civic guilds, the loophole held. Another strategy was to incorporate unusual materials: rope soles, linen uppers, or felt layers, which weren't covered by the usual shoemaking laws. Some monks even stitched scripture verses into the lining as a sort of divine deterrent against confiscation. One quirky example survives in an old inventory from a Benedictine abbey in the Loire Valley. 4 pairs of sandals, leather, unsealed, 3 pairs rope-wrapped, marked with the sign of the fish, 1 pair worn thin by Abbot Guillaume, who walks with urgency. Bless him. You peek now into a side chapel lit with beeswax stubs, where 2 pairs of sandals rest beside a simple bench. They're crude, no arch support, the kind of thing that makes your arches ache just looking at them. But they're honest, made with intent, stitched in silence. The guilds eventually struck a quiet bargain. So long as monks didn't sell their shoes beyond cloister walls and didn't teach their methods to outsiders, they'd be left alone. Some cities even allowed one designated monastic stall at seasonal fairs, though the shoes had to be clearly marked as religious goods. Open scholarly debate continues on whether this arrangement was practical diplomacy or a kind of grudging surrender. Some guilds saw monks as allies, providing charity shoes, burial sandals, and working quietly in the background. Others saw them as holy rivals, and the monks, for their part, rarely complained. They kept stitching, kept walking, kept their toes dry. You rise now and leave the courtyard, Your steps once again softened by your imaginary footwear. Perhaps it was made by a guild master, perhaps by a quiet monk with a crooked needle and a sense of peace. Either way, it holds, and it walks you deeper into the story. You pass under a low stone archway where ivy curls like a sleeping cat, and the road opens suddenly into a wide space, a kind of forgotten square hemmed in by leaning walls and the warped remnants of old stalls. This was once a market, though now only shadows remain, and you can almost hear the echo of barkers and bells. And here, perhaps under one of these worn beams, you find the remains of an odd tradition, a broken sign with faint lettering, and a rusted hinge still dangling. This was once the site of the seasonal shoe audit. Because yes, just when you thought the guilds couldn't get more meticulous, they also had seasonal shoe reviews, not just a market inspection or an inventory count. These were planned, ceremonial, sometimes even festive events where guild inspectors, town officials, and nosy neighbors all gathered to assess the footwear produced since the last audit. A kind of public unboxing, if you will, with fewer influencers and more dust. Held typically twice per year, once after the harshness of winter and again before the autumn rains, these audits were designed to showcase the year's work, weed out bad products, and remind everyone that yes, rules still apply, even to your favorite cobbler. Shoemakers were expected to submit their best work, not their flashiest. Guilds frowned on flair, but their soundest, even stitching, balanced soles, proper materials. The inspectors would sort the shoes into categories: acceptable, in need of adjustment, and excessive or fraudulent. That last one could be dramatics. Historians still argue whether the dramatic shoe burnings, often associated with these audits, were real or just exaggerated moral tales. But there is at least one account from Avignon in which confiscated shoes were burned publicly in a brazier while a guild elder read aloud the violated statutes like a particularly judgmental bedtime story. Shoemakers watched, grim-faced. Buyers gasped. Children were reportedly delighted. One quirky record from Metz describes a guild master who attempted to sabotage the audit by hiding defective shoes behind barrels of cider. His ruse was uncovered when a cat knocked one over, revealing a stash of mismatched clogs. The punishment? 3 weeks of public shoe polishing and a mandatory refresher course in sole alignment. You move through the square slowly, past what remains of a raised platform, likely once the inspection dais, where the shoes would be displayed. Each pair would have been tagged with the shoemaker's mark, often burned into the leather and inspected by hammer, rod, and in some towns, a small metal scoop used to test seam depth. Guilds loved their tools. For shoemakers, this was a stressful moment. One poor showing could dent your reputation. Too many poor showings? You could be suspended, barred from the next fair, or, in extreme cases, stripped of your right to operate entirely. And yet, these audits were also a time of community. The town gathered, children played tag between booths, older craftsmen offered critiques, some helpful, some less so. And a particularly generous guild in Tours turned their audit day into a feast, complete with roasted pigeons and sweetmeats. The inspection took place mid-morning, the judgments were issued by noon, and then everyone promptly forgot their rivalries over wine and custard. Open scholarly debate continues on whether these audits genuinely improved quality or simply reinforced the guild's grip on the craft. Some argue they created innovation, prompting shoemakers to refine techniques and share best practices. Others believe they stifled experimentation. After all, if you try something new and get shamed in the town square, you're unlikely to try it again. But there is something oddly comforting about the ritual of it all. The shoes, lined in rows like obedient pupils, the guild elders in their robes, the measuring rods, the hammers, the judgment, and afterward, the celebration. You look down now and imagine placing your own pair on the dais. Imaginary though they are, would they pass? Would they wobble? Would the stitching hold beneath the inspector's prodding fingers? Maybe, maybe not. But they've carried you this far, and there's something to be said for shoes that tell stories, even if their seams are a little frayed. The road you follow now is thinner, stitched tightly between crooked buildings like a seam itself. You brush past laundry lines that's sagging like sleepy eyelids and duck beneath a jutting beam, the night folding soft around you once again. There's a distant tapping sound ahead, not a hammer this time, but a dance of some kind, a rhythm muffled and low. You follow it to a tiny square lit by a single lantern. Beneath its warm orange glow, a woman twirls slowly, slippered feet sliding over the stones. No music, just movement, and her shoes, slim, soft, and utterly forbidden in most towns. Because tonight, you've wandered into the realm of dancing shoes and civic disapproval. Yes, even footwear designed for joy, celebration, and mild inebriation didn't escape the regulations of medieval French guilds. In fact, especially dancing shoes were scrutinized. Why? Because they represented freedom, extravagance, an evening of forgetting rules in a world where rules ran everything. Dancing shoes were typically soft-soled, made from lighter leathers or even cloth, and often fitted with extra long points in the toes, sometimes curved, sometimes just obnoxiously extended. And because they weren't worn for trudging through mud or hauling sacks of barley, they could be playful, decorative, dangerous. Guild records from Dijon complain of velvet shoes with whorled toes and lace bindings most unsuitable for public display. One even described them as shoes for sinning feet. Sounds dramatic, but there's truth to it. These shoes were associated with taverns, festivals, and forbidden trysts. Historians still argue whether the dislike for dancing shoes stemmed from moral panic or from frustration at unlicensed shoemakers creating them, likely both. In some towns, only specific guild-approved cobblers could make them. In others, they were outright banned. But as you're learning, banning something rarely makes it vanish. Shoemakers simply disguised the shoes, sewing more practical soles onto frivolous uppers, or hiding sequins beneath flaps. One quirky record from Lyon details a man caught selling work shoes that just happened to glitter under moonlight. His defense? They are for the moonlit fields. He was fined, but respectfully. You sit now on the edge of a fountain and watch the dancer complete her slow circle. Her slippers whisper against the stone, barely audible, perfectly smooth. The fabric glints just enough to catch the eye, and those toe points, comically long, the kind of shoes you'd trip over walking sober and strut confidently in after a tankard of ale. Dancing shoes also intersected with class tensions. In aristocratic courts, special dance shoes were made for each ball, sometimes dyed to match gowns or embroidered with the family crest. In towns, merchants mimicked the style, sparking guild complaints that the merchant's wife should not dress the feet of a duchess. And yet, these shoes endured. Open scholarly debate continues on whether their popularity helped loosen guild restrictions over time, or whether they remained a kind of wearable rebellion. What is clear is that the more the guilds tried to ban them, the more people wanted them. There's something timeless in that, isn't there? You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the scene. A crowded hall, music pulsing from drums and flutes, skirts swirling, laughter spilling like wine, and across the floor, dozens of shoes not meant for walking, just twirling, skimming, flying. You open your eyes again. The dancer has gone, disappeared down an alley without so much as a farewell tap. Her shoes leave no sound behind, only the shimmer, only the memory, only the reminder that sometimes a little rule breaking, especially at your feet, makes the world more bearable. The air has shifted again. A thin mist drapes itself lazily across the cobbles, as if the town itself has pulled up a blanket. You drift on, guided now by flickers of warmth, laughter, torchlight, the clink of wooden mugs. Rounding a quiet bend, you find it, the back entrance to the guild hall. The big door is bolted, of course, but the little side door slightly ajar. You slip in, and just like that, you have stumbled into one of the most peculiar traditions of medieval French shoemaking, the guild feast, complete with competitive stitching. Yes, even cobblers need to unwind. Guild feasts were a twice-yearly affair in most towns, linked to saint days or seasonal milestones. Shoes were inspected by day, wine flowed by night, and under vaulted ceilings, with roasted fowl steaming on wooden platters and candles flickering against stone walls, shoemakers celebrated, not just with food, with contests, the highlight, the infamous stitch-off. It worked like this. 2 cobblers would be given the same materials, same leather, same tools, same ale level, and challenged to stitch the cleanest, most even seam in a set amount of time. They sat on wooden stools in front of everyone, sleeves rolled up, needles flying, threads snapping through leather like violin bows. And the crowd, raucous. You see it now. Spectators leaning in, apprentices whispering bets, a guildmaster squinting over his wine cup to judge the tension of each seam. Someone in the back sings a verse about the man whose stitch did slip, a traditional taunt passed down for generations. The prize, often a small coin purse, a ceremonial awl, or, most prized of all, a decorated pair of guild slippers, stitched by last year's winner, not for wearing, mind you, for displaying, a symbol of supremacy in the craft. Historians still argue whether these competitions improved overall quality or simply inflated egos, but one thing's clear. They were taken very seriously. One record from Toulouse describes a brawl that broke out when a journeyman accused a rival of waxing his thread with salamander oil, believed to glide through leather faster. Guild officials had to intervene, confiscating both shoes and suspending everyone involved from cider privileges. Quirky customs abounded. Some guilds required the stitch-off shoes to be ceremonially destroyed after judging, slashed open in front of the crowd to examine the inner seams. Others passed them around like relics, each attendee touching the toe for luck. Feasts weren't just about stitching, though. There were songs, most of them deeply bizarre. The Ballad of the Broken Boot, St. Crispin's Toe, Odes to the Left Shoe That Fit Too Well. There were riddles and storytelling contests, even dancing. One surviving menu from a guild feast in Chartres lists the following: roasted goose with mustard glaze, lentil mash in trenchers, apples poached in wine, bread of the shoeless, a flatbread eaten while reciting thanks for one's souls. You walk slowly now between long benches, your hand brushing the ghost of a goblet, the warmth of a vanished crowd. The stitching table still stands, its surface pocked with needle marks and wax stains. You imagine taking a seat, some threading your own needle. Could you hold your own? Would your stitches be straight, your back steady, your hands calm under the scrutiny of 30 cobblers and 5 casks of cider? Open scholarly debate continues on whether women were ever allowed to compete. Some records suggest yes, especially widows who inherited their husbands' shops. Others claim the feasts were strictly male spaces. But even if they weren't stitching, women were there, cooking, serving, watching, and often out-singing everyone else. As the imagined crowd begins to fade, replaced once more by mist and echo, you step back through the little side door, leaving behind the warmth and the wine, the pride and the play. But as your feet touch the quiet stones again, you feel it, the stitch of tradition running soft and even through the centuries. The torchlight fades behind you now, replaced once again by the cool hush of pre-dawn. The cobbles are slick with dew, and even the mice have settled in for a nap. Yet the town isn't entirely asleep, because in one shadowed alley, something stirs, a figure moving low quickly with a bundle under their arm. You pause behind a crumbling wall and watch. They look left, right, then vanish behind a stack of barrels. And just like that, you've witnessed a crime, not of passion, not of politics, but of shoe theft. It may sound laughable to you now. Shoes hardly seem worth stealing when you can find flip-flops at any corner store. But in medieval France, footwear was currency. It was identity. It was investment. And stealing shoes, that was serious business. Enter the rack of shame. Because yes, shoemaking guilds not only had elaborate systems of regulation and competition, they also had punishments, public ones. And for thieves, especially those who stole from guild members, the punishment was as creative as it was humiliating. The rack of shame wasn't a torture device. Not exactly. It was more like a mobile wardrobe of embarrassment. Imagine a wooden frame mounted on wheels, hung with mismatched, discarded, or unfinished shoes. The convicted thief would be strapped inside, arms and legs exposed, and required to parade through town wearing a full outfit made entirely of mismatched or unpaired footwear, shoes on his hands, a hat made of soles, sometimes even slippers stitched together as a vest. The goal? Public ridicule, and it worked. Historians still argue whether the rack of shame originated in Paris or not, but its use spread quickly across guild towns. It wasn't just about punishing the thief, it was about protecting the guild's reputation. If shoes could be stolen with impunity, it suggested the guild had lost control, and that was unacceptable. Punishments escalated depending on the crime. Stealing shoes from a stall, 1 day on the rack. Stealing guild-certified shoes, 3 days plus a fine. Stealing an inspector's shoes, immediate expulsion, and in one case, forced barefoot exile from the town walls. That man later became a shepherd. Open scholarly debate continues on whether these punishments were primarily ceremonial or actively enforced. Some scholars suggest the rack was used sparingly. Others claim it was a crowd favorite, particularly during feast weeks when public shaming drew large, delighted audiences. One quirky account from Lyon tells of a boy who stole a pair of velvet-lined slippers, only to be caught when the dye rubbed off on his ankles. During his rack walk, he was pelted not with rotten fruit, but with shoelaces, a subtle, stylish insult. But it wasn't always about ridicule. Sometimes it was about restitution. In many towns, convicted shoe thieves had to repay the cost of the item, plus a symbolic extra. This extra was usually the cost of one toe's worth of leather. Sounds absurd, but it was meant to emphasize that even the smallest piece of a shoe had value. If they couldn't pay, they had to perform guild labor, sweeping stalls, preparing glue, or even repairing discarded shoes under supervision. That's how some thieves became apprentices. You walk now through another lane, passing shops still shuttered for the night. One window has a sign etched into the glass. No credit, no velvet, no shenanigans. You chuckle softly, a cobbler with a sense of humor, or maybe just one too many stolen souls. Shoe theft didn't always involve petty criminals either. Sometimes it was competitive sabotage. One cobbler in Rouen reportedly stole a rival's masterwork submission the night before inspection. He hid it inside a loaf of bread. Unfortunately, the shoe smoked during baking, and the plot was revealed by a very confused baker and one ruined rye. You approach a small fountain now, where a tiny plaque reads, "Here stood the rack of shame. May your souls be honest." You smile, because in a world so tightly stitched with rules and rituals, even the punishment had a kind of poetry. A thief may steal a shoe, but the guild would steal your dignity. The mist clings to your sleeves now, soft and cold, like an early morning breath. A rooster coughs somewhere, not quite crowing yet, just threatening to. The stars above you have paled to the edge of gray, and rooftops seem to watch you from their tiled perches. You pass a faded sign that creaks in the wind, Maison de l'étrange, House of the Strange. You enter, of course, because now we wade into one of the more peculiar corners of the shoemaking world, bizarre shoes and their purposefully pointless functions. You might expect practicality from a medieval shoemaker. After all, roads were muddy, winters were brutal, and feet, surprise, needed protection. But some shoes were not made to walk or run or do anything particularly useful at all. They were made to provoke or delight or just confuse. Shoes with curled toes like cinnamon rolls, designed not for comfort, but status. Some towns required that the tips of these shoes, called poulaines, be stiffened with whalebone or moss. That's right, moss. Just in case your toes weren't pointy enough, nature could help. Shoes with bells sewn into the tips, jingling softly with each step. A gentle warning. Someone fabulous is approaching. Shoes designed to look like animals, with pig snouts or dragon scales molded into the uppers. Some scholars argue these were festival shoes. Others insist they were jokes crafted by apprentices with too much time and too little supervision. And then there were the platform shoes of the 15th century, cork or wood stacked 2-3 inches high to lift the wearer above the muck. The guilds begrudgingly allowed them, so long as they weren't more than 2 fingers deep, a measurement so vague it led to endless arguments and one particularly funny fistfight between 2 cobblers using their thumbs as evidence. Historians still argue whether these decorative shoes were tolerated because of their artistry or merely endured as inevitable flamboyance. Most guilds looked the other way until someone fell off a platform and sued. You reach a table inside the House of the Strange, its surface cluttered with dusty relics, a shoe with 2 toes, like a hoof, a pair sewn backwards, heel in front, toe in back, a boot with 4 buckles but no opening, impossible to wear without a shoehorn the size of a sword. One particularly odd specimen is stuffed with straw, scented with lavender, and stitched entirely with white thread, clearly meant for a wedding, though possibly also for exorcisms. The line was blurry, and still, these shoes mattered because they were expression, not rebellion. A reminder that even in a world bound by guild rules, tax stamps, plus stitching quotas, and leather inspections, there was still room for whimsy. One quirky tale from Béziers tells of a cobbler who made a pair of shoes shaped like fish, scales painted, fins stitched on. He sold them only to people who could name 3 kinds of trout, niche marketing, medieval edition. And yet, even the guilds had a soft spot for these oddities. Some held exhibitions, brief windows where rules were relaxed and shoemakers could showcase their strangest work. The best were awarded medals, or occasionally pies. One surviving document lists winners of a fanciful footwear festival in 1422. The winning entry, a pair of sandals carved entirely from cherry wood, which promptly cracked during judging. You return to the doorway now, taking one last look at the scattered shoes. Some are cracked, some ridiculous. All once wore a purpose, even if that purpose was, well, to make someone laugh. Open scholarly debate continues on whether the strange shoes were commissioned or made just for fun. Either way, their presence offers a breath of fresh air in an otherwise tightly laced world, because maybe, just maybe, not every step needs to make sense. Sometimes, it's enough that the shoe fits, weirdly. The first hint of sunrise brushes the tops of the crooked chimneys now, gilding the clay tiles with the gentlest gold. You move slower, your steps softened by sleep and all the souls you've imagined along the way. The city seems to sigh, as if it too has heard all your thoughts about thread counts and velvet fines. And here, at the edge of the old tannery quarter, you come to what feels like the final stop. A long, low building marked by a faded carving of a boot above the door. This is where shoes go, not to be sold or worn, but to be judged, because this is the home of the masterpiece tradition, the final test for any journeyman hoping to rise, at last, to full guild membership. The process was sacred and difficult and deeply, exhaustingly fussy. To become a master shoemaker, you didn't just have to know your stitches or survive inspections. You had to submit a masterpiece, a perfect pair of shoes, crafted to the guild's exacting standards that demonstrated not just competence but brilliance. The materials assigned by the guild. No choosing your favorite hide or getting lucky with soft leather. You'd be handed a parcel, 1 pair's worth of materials, no more, no less. The design is specified in a sealed envelope, sometimes chosen at random. One journeyman might be asked to make a ceremonial slipper, another a hunting boot. One poor soul in Orléans reportedly drew child's shoes for the festival of Saint-Veronique, which required 7 decorative buttons and a tiny stitched lamb on the heel. You had a set time, often 3 days. Some guilds allowed a single assistant, usually just to hold tools or fetch thread. Others required solitude to ensure no hints of collaboration. Historians still argue whether this strict process ensured true skill or simply weeded out the less politically connected. After all, judges were senior masters, and senior masters had opinions, some fair, some personal. You picture it now, the candidate sitting alone in a drafty chamber, candles flickering, hands cramping by the second day, the smell of glue hanging in the air like tension, a single miscut panel, and you're done. No do-overs. One quirky tale tells of a journeyman in Marseille who, while working on his masterpiece, accidentally stitched a mouse into the lining. He submitted it anyway. The mouse was discovered during judging. Instead of expelling him, the guild declared it a symbol of vigilance as Rand let him pass. He later became the guild's treasurer. Most weren't so lucky. Failed masterpieces were returned with a single nail through the soul, a quiet, brutal message. Try again or don't. But for those who passed, glory. You were admitted as a maître cordonnier, full master shoemaker, with all the privileges that came with it, your own mark, the right to take apprentices, a seat at the feast, and, in some towns, a ceremonial pair of red-tasseled slippers you weren't allowed to wear but had to keep prominently displayed. One guild in Rhymes even held a small parade for new masters, parading their approved shoes on a velvet pillow like royal babies. Open scholarly debate continues on whether this tradition inspired artistic growth or discouraged innovation, but nearly all agree it was memorable. Journeymen remembered the weight of their masterpiece shoes for the rest of their lives. You glance up now at the carved boot above the door, weathered, cracked, but still there. The building may be quiet, the guild long dissolved, but the story remains that once someone sat here, heart pounding, hands steady, and made the best shoes of their life, and maybe, just maybe, those shoes never touched the ground. The sun has breached the rooftops now, softening the whole city with that hazy blush of morning. Everything glows, stone, wood, moss, even the air itself. You drift toward the last lane, where ivy hugs the walls like a sleeping cat, and your footfalls echo just once before fading into hush. The quiet feels earned now, a reward after miles walked in memory and imagination. And here, where the street bends like a bowstring pulled taut, we arrive at the final chapter of our journey, final souls and legacy stitches. Because though the guilds may be gone, and cobblers no longer inspect shoes with tiny hammers and scowls, their legacy tiptoes quietly into our modern world. The tools have changed, plastic soles, machine stitching, synthetic dyes, but the principles, they linger, the care, the craft, the odd pride in even stitching, the instinct to pause at a fine pair of brogues and murmur, well now, that's a tidy welt. That's the ghost of the guild speaking through you. In some towns across France, you can still find faint traces of the old guild system, a faded plaque here, a preserved measuring rod there. A few shoemaking schools still teach traditional stitch methods. A few leather shops still wrap hides in the old way, waxed cloth tied with twine, labeled in a curled script. They do it not because it's necessary, but because it feels right. Historians still argue whether the collapse of the guilds was a loss to craftsmanship or a gain for innovation, but all agree the guilds formed a framework, one that shaped not just shoes, but identity, labor, pride, and even politics. You pass now a final doorway. It's half hidden, almost shy, framed by curling vines and the smell of old beeswax. On the sill sits a shoe. One shoe, small, worn, the kind a child might have worn, or a cobbler kept. Long after the other was lost, it's laced with red thread, fraying just slightly. And inside, written faintly on the leather, June 1467, a signature stitched in, because guild members always left a mark. One quirky tradition, lost to time, held that each master shoemaker was buried with their first pair and their best, the first to show where they began, the best to prove how far they'd come. Whether this happened in truth or just in bedtime stories, we'll never know. But you like to think of it, don't you? Somewhere beneath the soft earth lies a well-worn shoe, stitched with care, blessed by a tiny hammer's tap, toe length measured, seams approved, a story, not just walked, but worn. And that's the thing with shoes. We outgrow them, we forget them, but they carry us, even when we don't look down, even when we drift, even when we dream. So now, dear listener, as dawn creeps fully over the rooftops and the city begins to stretch its arms and yawn, you find yourself slowing too. Your breath deepens, your thoughts soften, your limbs loosen like old laces. All around you, the cobbled streets you wandered begin to dissolve into haze. The shutters close gently behind the memory of apprentices, guild masters, soft-soled slippers, and dancing shoes that never quite followed the rules. The tiny hammer goes quiet. The measuring rod rests on its hook. The last shoe is stitched. There's nothing left to inspect, no finds to fear, no masterpieces to prove, only the calm hush of a world once obsessed with perfect seams, now slipping gently out of focus. Let your mind rest there, in the soft smell of tanned leather, the warmth of worn soles, the sound of stitches pulled tight and even. Let the weight of rules lift from your shoulders and leave only the comfort of knowing that even in a world ruled by regulations, there was always room for oddities, for laughter, for a really, really pointy toe. You've walked a long way tonight, through centuries, through styles, through stories. And now you can simply stop. Let the cobbles fade. Let the shoes slip off. Let your steps melt into stillness. Sleep well, friend. Sweet dreams. Good night.